Welcome to session 2 of the generosity practice. Last week we covered the first major idea from the teachings of Jesus on money and generosity. There is more joy in giving than receiving.
This is the foundation for a life of generosity, to realize that we're made in the image of a happy and generous God. And when we practice generosity, we actually live according to our design and tap into the joy of God Himself.
In week 1, we hope that you started to feel even a bit like giving is the good life, which is Randy Alcorn's paraphrase of an iconic saying of Jesus.
Up for today is the next theme in Jesus' teachings, watch out for greed.
Then in weeks ahead, we'll cover everything we have belongs to God and be generous to the poor.
Our plan for today is to explore Jesus' warnings about the dangers of wealth and also His invitation to slow down and simplify our lives in order to create margin for a life of generosity.
At a time of the plethora of activities and hurry, where it feels like the whole world is at its limits, this ancient invitation of Jesus to slow our lives down, simplify, and find our joy in God is more radical and more beautiful than ever before.
But before we dive in, let's take a few minutes to debrief last week's practice in triads. So circle up with 3 or 4 people, ideally the same group as the last session, and talk through the following questions. First, what spontaneous act of generosity did you practice this week and how did it go? Second, were you able to feel the joy of God in your practice? Third, what challenges did you face, emotionally, spiritually, or practically? Fourth, what new ideas about generosity have been growing in you since the last week? Turn to your triad and discuss.
The other day I was out hiking with friends. It was a muddy hike to a waterfall, and when we got back to the house where we were staying, our shoes were covered in goop. So we sat down by the hose and cleaned them off. Somehow we got into a conversation about what a big deal shoes were when we were kids. If you know anything about the social hierarchy of middle school, shoes are like the status symbol. Naturally, one of the guys brought up Air Jordans. All of us wanted a pair, but none of us had the money. We were laughing because they were $99, which at the time felt like a small fortune. We cleaned our shoes and left. A few hours later, my friend Micah texted the group a screenshot of his Instagram feed. It was an advertisement for Nike Air Jordans, wait for it, on sale for $99. That same afternoon, my friend Ben, who is not on social media because he is a wise man, goes to the search engine on his web browser, and the first advertisement is for Air Jordans. This is the world we live in. Experts say we see on average 3,000 to 5,000 advertisements a day, all designed to appeal not to our rational brain. Consumerism is not rational at all, but to our subconscious, to our fears and desires. And now all that advertising is amplified by algorithms designed to data mine for our deepest fears, insecurities, questions, hopes, and dreams by watching all we do and listening to everything we say from our front right pocket. The Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff calls this new economic model surveillance capitalism. And billions are spent on advertising every year. Executives are smart. They would not spend that money if it did not work. But even before our era of digital manipulation, the human heart has long been prone to believe the myth of more, the lie that if we just had a bit more, then we would be happy. But here is a truth that cuts across the spectrum of the human experience. No matter how much we get, it's never enough. The writers of Ecclesiastes said this thousands of years ago. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. In fact, the more we get, the more we want. It's that famous line from Rockefeller when the oil tycoon was asked, how much money is enough? He said, just a little bit more. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill because desire begets desire. Hedonism is like a treadmill. You're always walking, but you're never arriving. It's like chasing the carrot at the end of the stick. But even worse, the more we get, the more neurotic we become. This is the counterintuitive insight of Jesus. We think money will make us happy, but often, not only does it not make us happy, it often makes us less happy, more anxious, distracted, discontent, and lonely. As a result, we in the West live in the most affluent generation in human history. And yet so many of us are racked by fear, worry, greed, and unsatisfied desire. It comes as no surprise that the majority of Jesus' teachings on money are warnings about the danger of it. Let's look at a few examples. Here's Jesus in Luke 12. Watch out! Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Greed is similar to lust, but it's for things. It's an insatiable desire for more than we have and more than we need. And Jesus was right. There are all kinds of greed. There's a crass materialism kind of greed, a bigger house, a bigger TV, a bigger car. But there's also a more bespoke kind of greed that's more about exotic travel and eating out and boutique fashion. We are all vulnerable to some version of greed. Hence Jesus' line, watch out. Why? Why is greed so bad and dangerous? Because, next line, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. That's just not where the good life is to be found. But not only is wealth dangerous, look at this next saying from Jesus in Mark 4. Some people, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Notice Jesus' language, the deceitfulness of wealth. He doesn't say wealth is evil. He says it's deceitful. Why? Because it promises what it cannot give: happiness, contentment, identity, a felt sense of safety and security. And we fall for the lie again and again. And yet, wealth is often what is keeping us from the good life. Here's Jesus in Matthew 19. Truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you. Notice he has to say it twice because it's so incredulous. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Here, wealth is an obstacle to the good life, not the path. It's possible to follow Jesus into the kingdom and carry wealth with you, but it is very hard to do. Of course, all of us want to believe that we are the exception to the rule. Sure, most people could not do it, but I could. But Jesus' warning is haunting. Financial success can equal spiritual failure. That's an idea you rarely hear in our culture, but it's profoundly biblical, which is likely why the weight of Jesus' teachings on money are a warning against greed. The weird thing about greed is very few of us think of ourselves as greedy. As a pastor, I've had people confess all kinds of things to me: pornography, adultery, addiction, abortions. But I've never once had someone confess greed. Not once. we tend to unconsciously adopt the spending norms of our culture. And we live in one of the most greedy, materialistic cultures in history. Hence, we're often like the proverbial frog in the water. We don't realize it's killing our soul. Is there a practice from the way of Jesus to set our heart free from greed and form us into people who are deeply happy and at peace with what we have? Yes, it is the practice of generosity. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus says this to the Pharisees: "You Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." Wickedness is a generic term, but greed is specific. Notice the one sin Jesus calls out by name is greed. And then he says this: "But now, as for what is inside you, the foul greed that is like ruining your heart, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." Meaning, if there's a silver bullet for greed, it's this: generosity. Yes, it's true that the more we get, the more we want. But the inverse is also true. The more we give, the more happy and at peace we become. The word used by the biblical authors to name this kind of inner satisfaction is contentment. And it's one of the most underrated virtues in the world. If greed is being unsatisfied and racked by the desire for more, contentment is the opposite. It's being deeply happy with and grateful for what you have. It's being free of the desire for more. Let me show you one of the hallmark passages in the New Testament on contentment to bring this all together. Turn in your Bibles to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Here, Paul has not just an echo of Jesus' warnings about wealth, but also an alternative pathway to happiness. Look at verse 6. "Godliness with contentment is great gain." Meaning, true wealth is not having a lot, it's being happy in God and content with what you have. Recently, a friend of mine who is one of 6 kids said to me, "My father has never made a lot of money, but he says all of the time, 'I am a rich man.'" That's the idea of contentment. For, verse 7, "We brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. As the saying goes, you can't take it with you. All wealth is temporary. Either you will lose it all the day you die, or you will lose it way before that. But," verse 8, "if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." The Greek word translated clothing literally means covering. The idea here is, if we have the basics of life, food, clothing, and shelter, as long as we have God and each other, that's enough. Those who want to get rich, or that can be translated, those who long to be rich, or who set their hearts on being wealthy, fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. This line is often misquoted as "the love of money is the root of all evil." It's not. The NIV's translation is excellent. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, meaning it's the evil underneath so many of the evils in our soul and society. Money itself is not evil. It can do great evil or great good. I think of the power not only of generosity, but of business to make the world a better place. But neither is money neutral. It's powerful. Like nuclear energy, it can bring life or death. And it is very hard to steward that level of power well. I think of money like Frodo's ring in Tolkien's classic. Only the purest of hearts stand a chance at not being corrupted by its power. And even then, it's not a blessing as much as a burden on the soul that tends to deform the inner person. Money love is far more dangerous than most of us realize. Hence the next line, verse 10. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. This is dramatic language. It can be translated pierced themselves with many pangs, or wounded themselves with many sorrows, or caused themselves untold agonies of mind. As I watch people gain wealth, in my experience, the warnings of Jesus and Scripture are incredibly true. Not only does money not make most people happy, it often is the root of all kinds of evil. So, what is Paul's solution to the problem of greed? Contentment. The writer Randy Alcorn defines contentment as being satisfied in whose you are, who you are, and what you have. And goes on to say, those who love and serve Jesus can be truly content. Those who love and serve money can never be. To be content is to realize you have enough. Even more, it's to be happy with what you have. My problem is, I think I'll be content when I get a raise, or when I buy a home, or when I get through this season of life. But that's just not how contentment works. The truth is, we can be happy here and now through the practice of generosity. And there are two facets to this discipline that are like two sides of a coin. The first is the most obvious one. We give our resources away, which, as we'll cover in the next session, aren't ours in the first place, but God's. So we freely share. And giving is like God's antidote to greed. The more we give away, the less control money has over our heart. But the other side of generosity is to simplify our life, to edit it down to the essentials of what really matters. And both sides are critical. Catholic intellectual G.K. Chesterton famously said, "There are two ways to get enough. One is to continue to accumulate more and more. The other is to desire less." Put another way, there are two ways to be rich: earn more or want less. The second option is much, much easier. The disciplined pursuit of less has come to be called simplicity or simple living in the Christian tradition, or in more secular language, minimalism. And so much could be said about this discipline of simplicity. First off, simplicity is not the same thing as poverty. It's not about having nothing, but living with less. It's not a Scandinavian style of kind of minimalist decor. It's not the Christian version of tidying up. I would define simplicity as limiting the number of our possessions, expenses, activities, and social obligations to a level where we are free to live joyfully and generously in the kingdom with Jesus. It's flipping the question from what else can I get to what can I do without? And this question only makes sense inside a worldview like that of Jesus, where there's more joy in giving than in receiving. And where, as we just read, life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. At some point in this practice, we all need to explore the question, how much do we give? But the reality is, most people have so little margin in their life, they don't feel they can give much at all. To live a generous life, you need margin in your finances. You need a budget with room in it to share. You need margin in your schedule with room for interruptions, for people in need, for rest and delight. You need margin in your relationships. But most of us live far over our capacity, not under it. And nowhere is this more true than in our finances. The general rule for apprentices of Jesus practicing simplicity is people should look at how we spend our money, the cars we drive, the home we live in, how much we eat out, and they should assume we make way less money than we actually do. If you imagine a line for your income, most people live at or over the line in debt. We live under the line. Above the line is anxiety and misery. Below is contentment and generosity. This is the exact opposite of much of our culture. Where I live in Southern California, people are so image obsessed that it's incredibly normal for people to drive luxury cars and live in huge homes and yet live paycheck to paycheck, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The way of Jesus is the exact opposite. And this sounds nice, but it means we have to regularly discipline ourselves to not buy things we can technically afford. Paul says, did you catch that line? We will be content. The Greek word he uses implies a resolve of the heart to not give in to greed, but to be happy with what we have. And there are times when you have to draw a line in the sand. No more. I have enough. Everyone I know who is generous has some kind of self-imposed limit on their lifestyle. They work in both directions, toward generosity and away from greed. And listen, this practice looks different for all of us, based on our stage of life and income level and whether or not we have children. You may be struggling to put food on the table, but Jesus' warnings about greed are not just for the rich, and his call to be content is for all of us. To end, one of the most beautiful verses on contentment in the New Testament is in Hebrews 13. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Keep your heart free. When people speak of financial freedom today, they usually mean early retirement. But you can make so much money that you never need to work again and be anything but free. You can be enslaved to greed and fear. True financial freedom isn't millions of dollars in the bank. It's what Richard Foster called a joyful unconcern for possessions. That's the Jesus way. That's the goal. Not riches or poverty, but freedom and generosity. But notice what Hebrews says next. Because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Ultimately, what we are searching for in money can only be found in God. Whether it's peace or happiness or safety and security or identity or satisfied desire, we think if we can just get a little bit more, then we'll be content. But what we are searching for in money can only be found in God. And the good news, the gospel is, we already have all we need, access to the kingdom. God is our Father provider, and he will never leave you or forsake you. Right here and right now, you have everything you need to live a happy life in God.
Let's take a few minutes now to process this in community.
Because of the taboo in our culture around talking about money and generosity, we often fight fear and greed in private and alone, but we need each other to live freely.
Here are a few discussion questions to work through as a group. First, if you were to measure your level of contentment on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is feeling the anxiety of greed and a desire for more, and 10 is feeling non-anxious and satisfied with what you have, where would you plot yourself right now? Second, where are you experiencing a lack of margin in your life, in your relationship, schedule, or finances? Third, what is one area in your life that you could simplify? And fourth, name some of the best things in your life right now. What are you most grateful for?
We'll be back after your conversation with the coming week's practice.
Hi, I'm Josh. This is my wife, Abby. And for years of our marriage, there was kind of like, there's enough to pay rent and to get groceries, and then that's it. And we were quite happy. So when that season of life changed, and when I got a different job, and when we weren't as impoverished as we had been, it seemed like way more money than we needed. And so we had to sit down and go like, where is this going to go? And now we have more money for this. And I felt a sense of kind of dark excitement that I was like, I could get stuff. I could buy stuff for me. And she was kind of slowing me down. Well, okay, but is that really what we want to do with the money, the extra money? We never did that before. And what does that mean? We should think through it thoughtfully. And that's actually the first time we ever had a conversation about what does it look like to have a generosity line in our budget. The first time we set it out, the idea was, and it was mostly Abby's brilliance, was that you have all these necessities as adults, and by necessities I mean things like rent, groceries, the things that you need for basic survival. But then we realized very quickly that a lot of the things that we defined as necessities were actually luxuries. And so we broke those two things into two separate categories. The things that we have to have, rent and groceries, and then the things that we choose to have. And that second category, that's the stuff that we're spending on ourselves. We choose to spend this money on ourselves, to go out to eat, to be able to watch movies. And so Abby's idea was to have a third category for generosity, and for that number to be higher than the second category, so that we could actually look at the budget and quantifiably say, we're spending more money on other people than we spend on ourselves. We wanted to be able to say, are we being generous, or are we honoring the idea that Jesus argued that it's actually better to give things away than it is to receive things, and to be able to say, at least on paper, in our budget, the number that represents what we give away is higher than the number that we keep for ourselves. And that became the generosity line in the budget.
Yeah, from that time forward, I mean, obviously it's an ongoing reminder, but that like anything that we have, from like little things to bigger things to actual money to time, is that all of it is borrowed, and to like give generously with like what we have.
Now it's time to take Jesus' teachings and put them into practice.
Jesus said, sell your possessions and give to the poor. In context, he wasn't saying you need to sell everything. He was saying be the kinds of people who regularly simplify their lives by selling their possessions and giving the money to the poor.
So the plan for this week is to do exactly that.
Our exercise for this coming week is to identify something you own that you don't need and either give it away or sell it and give the money to someone in need. Simple.
We're not asking you to sell everything, just something. Maybe you have a record collection that's collecting dust, or a surfboard, or bike you barely ride, or far too many pairs of shoes or jackets.
Or maybe there's an item you love and use all the time, but as you pray, you begin to feel a gentle pull in your heart from the Spirit to just give it away.
This may be really hard and feel excruciating initially, and that's okay. Dare I say good. It's cutting away your emotional attachment to things, but on the other end is freedom.
Our reach exercise for this week is to simplify. Pick an area of your life, your closet, bedroom, living room, or garage. Go through it thoughtfully and peacefully and declutter it of every extra thing. You can give your extra stuff away to the poor via Salvation Army or a local donation drop, or give directly to someone you know.
To simplify your whole life and home is a long process that takes weeks or months, and it can have dramatic effects on your discipleship to Jesus. So we created a free guide to simplifying your life, and put a QR code in your guide if you want to simplify over the coming weeks. This week, We're reading chapter 5 to 8 in Given is the Good Life by Randy Alcorn, and listening to part 2 of the Rule of Life podcast on generosity. But again, all of this is invitational. We make recommendations and you make decisions.
To close, may God bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, you may have all that you need. May you freely scatter your gifts to the poor. May God, who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, also supply and increase your store of seed and enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. May you be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion, and may your generosity result in thanksgiving to God.